It was one of those monthly family gatherings. We were all settled around the main dining table when my father looked at me, his brow furrowed, and asked in surprise, "Honey, why did you come in an Uber? Did something happen to the car we got you for your birthday?" Before I could answer, my husband Kevin smiled and said with complete calm, "That SUV is with my mom now. She needs it more." My father fell silent for a few seconds, and what he did next turned that day into a point of no return for my husband's fate. But before we get to that part of the story, imagine you're listening to this as a story on a YouTube channel. On the screen, someone would be asking you to type in the comments what city you're watching from, and not to forget to hit like and subscribe so the channel can keep growing and bring you even more intense stories. The main house of the Sterling family, my father Richard's family, felt warm and inviting that Saturday afternoon, but also imposing. It was a sprawling modern colonial estate in an exclusive part of Dallas, Texas. The front circular driveway, paved with natural stone, was lined with luxury cars, from the latest European sedans to massive SUVs, each worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Everything gleamed under the sun that had been beating down until thick clouds began to slowly blanket the sky. Inside, uncles, aunts, and cousins moved from one room to another, joking and laughing as they served themselves from a buffet prepared by the city's most prestigious catering service. At the main table, however, one chair remained empty, right next to my husband, Kevin. Kevin sat comfortably in a carved wooden chair, showing not the slightest concern for my delay. He seemed not to notice my absence at all. He was too busy slicing into a piece of perfectly grilled Wagyu steak on his plate and letting out exaggerated laughs whenever one of my cousins told a joke. He was wearing a loud, patterned silk shirt and a flashy gold watch. He was trying hard to look like he belonged in his wife's family, a family of truly wealthy entrepreneurs. He always felt the need to prove he deserved to be there, even though everyone in the room knew his position at the company was a gift from my father, Richard Sterling. His attitude, often overly confident and a little arrogant, made some family members uncomfortable, but no one ever said anything out of respect for my father, known for his patience and calm demeanor. Outside the estate, by the tall wrought iron gate, a dark blue Uber sedan pulled up under the fine rain that was beginning to fall on the still hot asphalt. The door opened and I, Claire, stepped out, covered in a pastel-colored hijab. I was a bit flustered. I had to rummage through my purse for a while to pay in cash because the driver's card reader wasn't working. Then I hurried out, holding my purse over my head to keep the fabric of my veil from getting soaked. There was no private chauffeur to open the gate for me, no one waiting with an umbrella. I ran across the wide courtyard, past the line of luxury cars that, ironically, mostly belonged to my own family. I reached the massive front door, out of breath. I paused for a second to fix my clothes, brushed the raindrops from my shoulders, and took a deep breath before entering that lion's den full of critical eyes. When I crossed the threshold into the main hall, the murmur of conversations died down for an instant. Then the voices returned, but distinctly lower. I felt all eyes on me. My appearance was simple, though neat. I was dressed decently and discreetly, in almost painful contrast to the opulence surrounding me. My face looked tired, with shadows under my eyes that I tried to hide with a faint smile. I walked towards the main table where my father, Richard, presided over the gathering from the head. He watched me with that mix of firmness and affection that only some fathers have. He saw my mud-splattered shoes, the slightly damp hem of my dress, and his paternal instinct kicked in immediately, sensing that something was wrong, something I had been trying to hide for a long time. My father placed his spoon on his plate with a movement so gentle that the small clink echoed in everyone's mind like a bell tolling. I approached, took his hand, and kissed it respectfully. He looked at me for a few seconds and then shifted his gaze to Kevin, who was still chewing, unperturbed, without making the slightest move to stand up or pull out a chair for me. Richard cleared his throat softly, and that sound was enough to completely silence the table. Then, with his deep, calm, and authoritative voice, he asked a question that seemed simple but would change his son-in-law's life forever. He asked why I was late, why I was soaked, as if I had come on public transport when just the week before he had gifted me a brand new car exclusively for my comfort. He wanted to know what had become of the gleaming Hyundai Palisade he had sent to my house as a birthday present. I remained silent, my lips trembling. I tried to come up with an excuse that wouldn't betray my husband because I didn't want to humiliate him in front of the whole family. I had always tried to protect his dignity, even if it cost me silent tears. But before I could utter a single word, Kevin spoke up, his mouth still half full, in an exaggeratedly relaxed tone with not a hint of guilt. "Oh, that SUV is with my mom, Rose, now. She needs it more. She uses it to go to her bridge club meetings. You know, Dad, in those circles, they look down on her if she shows up in just any old car. Claire, on the other hand, just goes to the office and she's all covered up with her veil anyway. She can take an Uber, it's more practical, and she doesn't even have to look for parking." A thick silence fell over the table. My aunts and uncles exchanged incredulous looks. Everyone knew that car was a personal gift from Richard to his only daughter, not a toy for his show-off mother-in-law. It wasn't just rude. It was a brutal demonstration of how little Kevin valued my well-being compared to his mother's pride. I lowered my gaze, my cheeks burning with shame, not for coming in an Uber, but for hearing my own husband boast about his decision in front of my father. I felt a lump in my throat. I clutched the fabric of my hijab tightly, wishing the floor would open up and swallow me. My heart ached to see how Kevin prioritized his mother's ego over my safety. But my father's reaction was not what Kevin had imagined. Richard didn't slam the table or jump up shouting. His face didn't turn red. He simply stared at him in silence, as if observing a strange insect. Then, a very slight smile appeared on his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He nodded a couple of times as if he were understanding the twisted logic his son-in-law had just laid out. In a neutral voice, my father commented that he didn't know Rose was using the SUV and that he appreciated Kevin's honesty. My husband interpreted this as a sign of approval, or at least as a sign of my father's powerlessness to oppose his decisions. He grinned, full of pride, convinced he had won the exchange. Underneath the silk tablecloth, however, Richard slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers, accustomed to working quickly, opened his messaging app and typed a brief order to the head of security and the operational team of his corporate group. He didn't need many words. A single message was enough to activate the asset recovery protocol. When he hit send, the storm looming over Kevin and his mother began to move in. In another part of the city, at the valet entrance of a luxury shopping mall, the atmosphere was very different. Despite the overcast sky, Rose was having her moment of glory. In front of the imposing main entrance, a black, immaculate Hyundai Palisade was parked at a slightly ostentatious angle so everyone could admire it. Rose stood beside it, chin held high, wrapped head to toe in designer labels, gaudily mismatched but with plenty of visible logos. A fake crocodile skin handbag hung from her arm, and her fingers were laden with oversized gold-plated rings. Around her, 5 friends from her bridge club, a sort of social gathering for ladies of a certain age, looked at her with various expressions: admiration, envy, and a certain restrained mockery, because they knew her origins were far more modest than she pretended. That day, however, the stage belonged to Rose. In a loud, proud voice, she told them that the enormous, elegant SUV was a special gift from her son, Kevin. She boasted that Kevin's business was booming and that he had been able to buy her a car worth nearly $60,000 in cash, no financing needed. She patted the hood of the vehicle affectionately as if stroking her son's shoulder, bragging about the comfortable, heated and ventilated seats and the sophisticated sound system. She didn't mention me, Claire, not once. It was as if her daughter-in-law didn't exist, as if all this prosperity came solely from her wonderful son. Her friends responded with false praise, inflating her ego even more. They called her blessed to have such a generous son. One of them, the one with the oldest car, even received a direct jab. Rose hinted that it was time for her to upgrade if she wanted to remain presentable. When her show was over, Rose announced she had to leave for a facial at the salon and waved goodbye like a grand dame. She climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted her posture to look taller, and waved to her friends. She pushed the start button with a triumphant smile, but instead of the engine's soft purr, a long, piercing beep sounded. The dashboard lit up bright red. All the warning lights flashed simultaneously, as if the car were in a state of total alarm. Before she could react, a cold, robotic, automated voice came through the speakers, informing her that the security system had been activated because the asset was being used by an unauthorized person. The voice repeated over and over that the engine had been permanently disabled by the administrator. Rose panicked. She repeatedly pressed the start button, stomped on the brake, and slapped the steering wheel. But the SUV remained dead, suddenly turned into a piece of luxury scrap metal. Cold sweat began to run down her forehead under her thick makeup. The situation became even more humiliating when the security system activated the horn in a persistent pattern, like a car alarm. The blare filled the mall's entrance, attracting the attention of guards, valets, shoppers, and, of course, all her bridge club friends, who hadn't left yet. Some began to laugh quietly as they watched Rose inside the car, banging on the windows in desperation like a fish trapped in a tank. She tried to open the door to escape the shame, but the central locking system, remotely controlled by Richard Sterling's security team, kept her locked inside her own fantasy of grandeur. At the headquarters of Richard Sterling's company, a young man in the IT department stared at his computer screen with a serious expression. He had just executed the high-priority order from the company's owner. On the monitor, the SUV's license plate appeared with the message, "Unauthorized use." He entered the next command to schedule the doors to unlock after 3 minutes, enough time to cause a psychological impact, and simultaneously sent the exact location to the asset recovery team, which was already on its way. Meanwhile, in the mall's valet area, those 3 minutes felt like an eternity to Rose. She watched as her friends took out their phones, not to help, but to record the spectacle. She cried and screamed, but her wails were muffled by the soundproof windows. Her eye makeup melted, leaving black streaks down her cheeks and shattering the image of the elegant lady she had worked so hard to project. When the click of the locks finally releasing was heard, Rose didn't get out immediately. She was paralyzed with shame, but she had no choice. A massive orange tow truck, with the Sterling Group's corporate logo painted on its sides, pushed its way through the crowd. 2 security guards in crisp black uniforms, burly and stern-faced, got out. They walked directly to the SUV. One of them knocked on the driver's window with his knuckles. He then used a device to open the door and asked Rose, in a polite but cold tone, to step out of the vehicle, as it was a misused corporate asset. When she screamed that the car belonged to her son and that she would call the police for theft, the guard produced a folder with the company's legal documents, authorizing its immediate removal. He read aloud words that echoed in the ears of Rose's friends. Vehicle inventoried as a company asset. Improper use by an unauthorized individual. Those phrases were enough for the group of friends to change their tune. The expressions of admiration turned into looks of ridicule and whispers. The word spread that the luxury car Rose had been flaunting as a cash gift from her successful son was nothing more than a company car from her son's father-in-law, now being repossessed. As Rose clung to the steering wheel, the guards firmly but non-violently removed her. She stumbled and fell to the ground. Her fake handbag burst open, scattering a cheap lipstick, crumpled tissues, and a wallet full not of cash, but of old receipts. As the tow truck hooked up the SUV and hauled it away amidst Rose's desperate sobs, no one came to her aid. Instead, people scrambled to upload the video to social media. It soon appeared on local gossip accounts with a cruel title, "Mother-in-law fakes being a millionaire, has in-law's car repossessed in front of luxury mall." Back at Richard Sterling's mansion, the family gathering continued, with no one suspecting the spectacle that had just unfolded across town. Soft piano music played, and guests were enjoying dessert. I, Claire, sat staring at my empty plate, trying to ignore the sounds of Kevin eating beside me. He was completely relaxed, even letting out a discreet burp without bothering to cover his mouth, convinced he had emerged victorious from the conversation with my father. He had no idea the calm in the dining room was the silence before a hurricane. Suddenly, his phone vibrated on the table and began to blast a jarring ringtone. Several of my uncles frowned, annoyed by the disrespect. Kevin saw his mother's name on the screen and smirked, assuming she was calling to thank him again for the car. He answered without getting up from the table, leaving the speakerphone on loud enough for everyone to hear in the background. His smile vanished instantly. Instead of words of gratitude, he heard Rose's hysterical screams mixed with choked sobs. Though her voice was distorted, everyone at the table got the gist. She was talking about thugs taking her car by force, about being humiliated in front of everyone, and about now being stranded on the street. Kevin's brain, accustomed to blaming others, made an immediate connection. He decided I must be the culprit. He was sure I had called the police or the insurance company out of spite. Rage flooded his mind. He threw his spoon against his plate with a metallic clang that silenced the entire room. He shot up from his seat, the chair screeching on the marble floor. He pointed a finger at me, his eyes wild, and began to scream, "You ungrateful wife! What did you do to my mother's car? She's been made a fool of because of you, because of your petty games." The veins in his neck bulged, his face turning pale. I looked at him, exhausted, with a mix of sadness and pity. I opened my mouth to explain that I hadn't done anything, but I didn't get to say a word. Richard Sterling's deep voice cut through the air like a hot knife. He rose calmly from his seat at the head of the table without raising his voice or banging his fist. He simply raised one hand, signaling for Kevin to be quiet. Miraculously, he obeyed. My father walked around the table with a steady pace until he stood just a few feet from his son-in-law. He looked him directly in the eyes with the cold gaze of someone who has faced many rivals in business. Calmly, he explained that there was absolutely nothing wrong with the car and that no thief had taken it. The company had decided to retrieve the vehicle because it was being used by an unauthorized person. Kevin's jaw dropped. Richard continued, his tone even colder. He mentioned that he had heard Kevin's mother needed transportation and that, indeed, she now had it, public transportation. He suggested Kevin hurry and go find her, wherever she was, because the poor woman was probably standing in the sun or rain. Kevin, stammering, tried to justify himself, saying he had to get back to the office, that he had a lot of work to do. My father interrupted him with a slight, chilling smile. He asked for the keys to the sedan Kevin had driven that day, the company car he had been using for years. Kevin instinctively clutched his pocket, refusing to hand them over. Then Richard, without losing his composure, explained that the car was a perk for company employees and that, as of 5 p.m., that day, Kevin's name was being removed from the payroll for serious violations of the Code of Ethics and misuse of company resources. The announcement fell on Kevin like a death sentence. In the middle of a family meal, without drama or shouting, his father-in-law had just fired him. He felt the blood drain from his face. He looked around for support, but only found cold eyes and disapproving gestures. No one defended him. Richard extended his hand, and trembling, Kevin finally handed over the car keys, as if surrendering a part of his own identity. But the humiliation wasn't over yet. My father took a single $100 bill from his pocket, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the pocket of Kevin's silk shirt. He patted him on the shoulder and whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "This is for some affordable transportation. An executive Uber is too expensive. It's better if you also learn to live simply, like you said about my daughter." Then he motioned to the head of house security, who was already standing alert in a corner. 2 guards approached without aggression, simply positioning themselves on either side of Kevin, making it clear it was time for him to leave. Kevin looked at me one last time, hoping I would intervene, but I had already looked away, busy pouring hot tea for my mother, as if he had ceased to exist. With heavy steps, dragging his shame, Kevin was escorted out of the dining room, past the table laden with delicacies he would no longer taste. The front door closed behind him, and the conversation inside slowly resumed, as if a minor nuisance had simply been removed. Outside, Kevin found himself under a sky heavy with clouds. He had barely taken a few steps when the electric gate slowly closed behind him with a metallic thud that sounded like an entire life shutting down. He stood motionless on the sidewalk, looking at the illuminated mansion where he should have been spending the afternoon as a privileged son-in-law. Now he was an expelled intruder. The sky suddenly broke, and a downpour began to fall with force. Kevin took refuge under a skinny tree, but the leaves were not enough to protect him. His silk shirt, bought with a credit card in Claire's name, clung to his soaked body. He took out his phone with shaky hands and opened the rideshare app. He wanted to flee before any neighbors saw him in this state. The screen returned an unexpected message. Drivers could not enter the private gated community without authorization from a homeowner. He tried calling the security booth, but no one answered. His number was blocked. His only option was to walk nearly 2 miles to the main entrance of the residential complex to call a car from there. That distance, which he used to cover in seconds inside a luxury vehicle, became a path of penance. With his leather shoes soaked, Kevin began to walk down the street. Each step sank his soles into dirty puddles that splashed his pants. The wind threw rain against his face, mixing with the tears of rage he refused to let anyone see. Inwardly, he cursed me and Richard. In his twisted logic, he thought his father-in-law's reaction was excessive over a simple car, failing to understand that the real problem was his years of accumulated disrespect and ingratitude. As he walked, hunched against the downpour, powerful headlights illuminated him from behind. He stepped aside, thinking it was just a neighbor. The vehicle, a large white SUV identical to the model that had been taken from his mother, approached slowly. For a moment, Kevin harbored the absurd hope that Richard had changed his mind and sent someone to pick him up. That hope died when he saw clearly through the windshield. At the wheel was Richard Sterling himself, perfectly dry, driving calmly with one hand on the wheel, his face serene. Beside him, in the passenger seat, was me. I had changed into a warmer outfit and was holding a thermos of a hot drink. My face was calm. The car slowed as it passed Kevin. He looked at me desperately, hoping I would beg for it to stop, but I kept my gaze fixed forward, not wavering for a second. There was no hatred in my eyes, only absolute indifference. The SUV drove through a deep puddle, and a wave of muddy water splashed Kevin's pants, soaking him even more. He stood frozen, covered in mud and rain, watching the taillights disappear around the bend toward the community exit, leaving him alone in the darkness. An hour later, Kevin finally arrived at the small house he boasted was his home, though Claire paid the rent. He burst in, drenched and shivering. The interior was as messy as his life. On the living room sofa was Rose, curled up, her hair disheveled and remnants of smeared makeup on her face. She was also wet. It had clearly been a struggle for her to get back from the mall. As soon as she saw him, she sprang up and started screaming at him, without even asking how he was. She pointed a finger at him, demanding to know where her wonderful son had been while she recounted, with great exaggeration, the humiliation she had suffered at the mall, how they had treated her like a criminal, how everyone had laughed at her, and how the whole city was now mocking her. She accused him of not being a good son, of not defending her honor, of being too soft with Claire. Kevin, exhausted, his body numb and his pride shattered, finally snapped. He threw his briefcase to the floor and screamed back at her for the first time in his life. He told her that everything that had happened was a consequence of her insatiable ambition, her pathological need to show off. He confessed that he had been fired, that he had been humiliated in front of the entire family because of that stolen car she had decided to use as a trophy. Rose's eyes widened at the word fired, but her pride refused to admit her part. She immediately tried to turn the situation around, saying that if Kevin were truly successful and a millionaire, losing one job would mean nothing. The argument escalated into a violent exchange of accusations and blame, bringing old resentments to the surface. They only stopped when hunger twisted their stomachs. Neither had eaten since noon. The feast at Richard's house and the lunch at the mall had remained mere fantasies. In an attempt to ease the tension, Kevin took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. He thought they could at least afford to order a good fast food dinner to forget the day. He opened the food delivery app, selected the largest family combo from their favorite fried chicken place family meals, sides, large drinks. The bill was around $80. He chose to pay with the credit card he always used and hit confirm. The screen showed a loading circle, then a message in red, "Transaction declined." He frowned and tried another card, the most prestigious one he flaunted to his friends. Same result. Breaking into a cold sweat, he tried one card after another, credit, debit, the grocery store card. All of them were declined. Then, like a punch to the gut, he remembered that all these cards were supplementary, linked to Claire's primary account. His entire lifestyle had been built on his wife's money. With trembling hands, he opened his banking app to check his own payroll account. The screen showed a pitiful balance, about $10. The last of his own salary, most of which he had spent on appliances for his mother the previous month. That account, moreover, would soon be closed now that he was fired. He looked at Rose, pale, and stammered that there was no money, that all the cards were blocked. His mother responded with a desperate scream, throwing a cushion at him, crying about her misfortune as if none of it were her responsibility too. Suddenly, an insistent beeping came from the electric meter, the signal that the prepaid balance was about to run out. Accustomed to having Claire's family staff automatically top up the utilities, neither of them had thought to buy electricity. Kevin fumbled in his pockets and found, crumpled and damp, the $100 bill Richard had given him. Before he could decide what to do, the meter made a clicking sound, and the entire house plunged into darkness. The fan stopped. The TV went black. A deep night fell upon them. In that darkness, interrupted only by lightning flashes through the window, Rose's childish sobs could be heard as she huddled on the sofa. Kevin sat leaning back, his stomach empty, his body shivering, and his mind blank. That night, for the first time in his comfortable, dependent life, he tasted real poverty, no food, no light, no one to ask for help. The next morning, the sun beat down violently on the small house, making the heat even more suffocating. Kevin woke up sticky with sweat. He had slept poorly, without a fan or air conditioning. The dining table was bare, no coffee or bread. In the bathroom, there was barely any water left in the toilet tank. He cleaned himself up as best he could, put on the same shirt from the day before, now dry but stained, and looked at his reflection in a cracked mirror. Deep dark circles, a scruffy beard, the defeated look of a man who refuses to accept reality. Despite everything, his ego still whispered that this might just be a tantrum from his father-in-law. He decided to go to the office to clear up the misunderstanding. He headed to the city's financial district, this time on public transportation, crammed into a bus full of workers, clothes sticking to their bodies, breathing in the smell of sweat and reheated food. When he arrived at the skyscraper that housed the Sterling Group's headquarters, he straightened his collar and tried to muster some dignity. He entered the gleaming marble lobby and headed for the turnstiles with his employee ID badge around his neck. He swiped the card on the reader as always, and the machine emitted a sharp beep as the light turned red. Access denied appeared on the screen. He tried once, twice, 3 times, each with growing desperation, while the line of employees behind him muttered uncomfortably at the delay. Before he could lose his temper with the machine, 2 security guards stood in front of him. One of them was the same man he had often treated like a servant, ordering him to buy cigarettes or carry his mother's shopping. Now, the guard looked at him without a trace of respect. In a neutral voice, he informed him that he was barred from entering the building by direct order of management. His name was on the banned list. Kevin tried to scream that he wanted to speak with HR, that it was all a mistake, but the guard just shook his head. He reached behind the counter and pulled out a cardboard box, the kind used for instant noodle packets. He pushed it into Kevin's chest. Inside was everything he had kept on his desk. A broken picture frame with a photo of him and Claire, a mug that said boss, a stapler, and a few cheap pens. On top of the pile was a white envelope with the company letterhead. Kevin opened it and read the termination letter. In formal, blunt language, it listed gross integrity violations, fraudulent use of assets, and damage to corporate reputation. There was no severance package, no letter of recommendation. Clutching the box to his chest like a castaway clinging to a plank, he stumbled out of the building. He sat on a bench in a small nearby park under the relentless sun and pulled out his phone once more. If he couldn't go back to this company, he told himself, maybe a rival firm would take him. After all, he had experience and good contacts. He started calling managers he knew at other groups. The first, a marketing director who had once tried to poach him, answered with an uncomfortable voice. After a few seconds of forced small talk, he admitted he already knew everything. "The business world is small," he said, "and the reputation of someone fired by Richard Sterling for ethical breaches is like poison. No serious company wants to take that risk." He hung up with a hurried apology. The next calls yielded similar results. Some didn't answer, others blocked him, and one was brutally clear, telling him his name was on the HR Association's blacklist. Kevin then understood that Richard hadn't just closed one door, he had shut down the entire job market for him. A week passed, and the downfall of Kevin and Rose accelerated. To eat, they began selling the house's appliances, one by one, the TV, the blender, even the microwave to street buyers for a few dollars. The money was barely enough for cheap food and some candles. In the midst of this precarity, a court messenger knocked on the door with a notice. Claire had filed for divorce. Kevin read the papers with a spark of malice in his eyes. Instead of seeing it as the end, he saw it as an opportunity. He thought about the assets accumulated during their 3-year marriage, gifts, investments, comforts. Convinced he was entitled to half of everything, he spoke to Rose, who immediately grew excited at the idea. She encouraged him to demand part of the family home, the cars, even shares in the corporate group, certain the law would be on his side as the legal husband. With the last of their money, they hired a cheap lawyer from a small neighborhood office, more skilled in grand speeches than in winning cases. Kevin went to court confident he would walk out a rich man. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom's chill contrasted with the sticky heat outside. Kevin arrived in his best shirt, now a bit loose from the weight he had lost. He sat on the defendant's bench, making victimized faces to gain sympathy. When the courtroom doors opened on the other side, Claire entered. Her presence filled the room. She wore a long navy blue dress and an immaculate hijab. Her face radiated serenity and determination. With her was a team of lawyers from a prestigious family law firm, men and women in impeccable suits carrying briefcases full of documents. The judge first heard Claire's petition and then Kevin's response. When it was time to discuss the division of assets, Kevin's lawyer launched into demanding exorbitant figures, arguing that his client had contributed work and stability and deserved half the estate, plus compensation for the emotional distress of the separation. Kevin even shed a couple of fake tears, talking about how he had been thrown out on the street with nothing. Rose, sitting behind him, nodded vehemently, imagining the money that would soon be theirs. But their joy was short-lived. Claire's lead attorney stood up calmly. He didn't counter with emotional speeches, but with numbers. He asked the judge for permission to present the results of a forensic financial audit of the 3 years of marriage. He placed a box full of bank statements, credit card bills, and transfer receipts on the table and began to explain. The documents proved that Kevin had not contributed a single dollar to Claire's support. His salary, modest compared to her income, had always been spent on his own whims and on Rose's ostentatious lifestyle. Worse, it became clear that all the luxuries they had enjoyed, overseas trips, Rose's designer bags, jewelry, renovations to his mother's house, had been paid for, with supplementary credit cards issued in Claire's name. Legally, these were debts incurred without express authorization and for purposes unrelated to the marriage's basic needs, making them a liability that fell on Kevin. Claire's lawyer presented a devastating summary. The total irresponsible spending amounted to around $170,000. Silence filled the courtroom. Even the judge frowned, looking at Kevin with disapproval. Kevin tried to stammer that everything had been a gift from his wife, but then it was Claire who asked to speak. In a soft voice, she swore she had never authorized such waste, that she had often chosen to save and invest in her business while watching money drain away for her mother-in-law's whims. She had stayed silent for years to protect the marriage, but if Kevin insisted on claiming half, she had every right to demand repayment of what was hers. Claire's lawyer filed a counterclaim, requesting that Kevin's debt be recognized and that any assets acquired with that money be seized. At the end of the hearing, the judge banged the gavel forcefully. After reviewing the evidence, he granted Claire the divorce. He completely rejected Kevin's claims for asset division and declared that Kevin was obligated to repay the spent funds. As collateral, he ordered the seizure of any assets registered in Kevin's or his mother's name that had been purchased with that money, including Rose's only house in her hometown. Rose's scream upon hearing the verdict echoed through the building. She shot up, her eyes wide with disbelief, unable to comprehend that her greed had led her to lose the very roof that had sheltered her for years. She fainted in the middle of the courtroom, causing a small commotion. Paramedics rushed in to help her while Kevin remained seated, motionless, as if his spine had been removed. He looked at Claire with the childish hope of finding at least a flicker of compassion, but she was already standing, adjusting her veil calmly. She walked out of the room, surrounded by her lawyers, without a single backward glance. Kevin felt he had dug his own grave. He had gone to court dreaming of getting rich overnight and ended up a divorced man, neck-deep in debt, with nowhere to go. Life for Kevin and Rose took a complete turn after that verdict. The seizure of assets was swift and merciless. Rose's house in her hometown, which she always mentioned as proof of her success, was marked with a red sign announcing it was confiscated by the state to be auctioned. With no home of their own, no savings, and evicted from the rented house in the city for non-payment, mother and son ended up in a small rented room in a rundown neighborhood at the end of a muddy alley where sunlight barely entered. The walls were unplastered brick. The asbestos sheet roof leaked, staining the ceiling, and a permanent smell of dampness and sewage hung in the air. Inside that suffocating box, the word luxury became a cruel joke. There was no thick mattress, no air conditioning, no elegant curtains, just a thin mat on the cold concrete floor. mosquitoes, rats scurrying overhead, and the constant murmur of equally desperate neighbors. Rose, the woman who once spent her days in beauty salons and at ladies' luncheons, now woke up before dawn, not for a workout or a social gathering, but to wash other people's clothes. She went from house to house in the neighborhood, offering her laundry and ironing services to people who worked in factories or at the market. Her hands, which once held only porcelain cups and shiny handbags, became calloused and cracked from the cold water and cheap detergent. She often cried in secret while scrubbing grease stains from shirts that smelled of sweat, wondering how she had ended up as a maid for the very people she would have once looked down on. The neighbors showed no mercy. When the work wasn't perfect, they scolded her without hesitation. Her complaints about the soap quality only made them laugh at her. Kevin, for his part, suffered an even more severe collapse. His college degree, which he used to flaunt as a trophy, was now worthless. Branded as dishonest and fired by an influential businessman, no company would hire him, not even the smallest ones. The door to the corporate world had closed for good. To eat, he was forced to take on heavy labor at the city's wholesale market, carrying sacks of rice, crates of vegetables, and burlap bags of onions that wrecked his back. His hands blistered, his skin darkened under the sun, and his body, once coddled by comfort, grew stooped under the load. His feet, once shod in impeccable shoes, ended up in nearly broken plastic sandals. Sometimes, stronger workers would push him or knock him to the ground, laughing at him. No one there knew he had once sat behind a desk in an air-conditioned office. Or, if they did, they didn't care. Every night, Kevin returned to the room with his body broken and a few coins in his pocket. Far from finding a place of rest, a new battle awaited him. Rose, unable to accept her new life, tormented him with reproaches. She called him useless, blaming him for letting a rich and generous wife like Claire get away. She repeated that if he had been smarter with Richard, they wouldn't be living in this pigsty. Kevin, exhausted, no longer had the strength to stay silent. He would snap back, accusing her of pushing him toward the ridiculous ostentation that had doomed them, of manipulating him into taking things that weren't his. Their life together became a hell of shouting, insults, and broken objects. The neighbors, tired of the noise, would bang on the walls and threaten to kick them out if they kept making scenes at night. In that cramped, stuffy space, any trace of affection between mother and son vanished, replaced by resentment and a regret that came far too late. A year after their fall began, while Kevin and Rose were trapped in this cycle of poverty and hatred, life moved on for everyone else. One afternoon, at an exclusive fine dining restaurant in the most expensive part of the city, the atmosphere was the complete opposite of their world of misery. Warm lights, polished marble, the scent of grilled steak and gourmet coffee, with jazz music floating in the air. At a table by a large window overlooking the main avenue sat Claire, across from Richard. I had changed a lot. I wore a modest fashion ensemble from a well-known designer and a printed silk veil. My face looked rested, with no shadows of sadness. That night, we were celebrating the grand opening of the 5th branch of my modest fashion boutique, a business I had rebuilt with my own effort and my father's financial advice. In a short time, it had become very popular among young, devout women both at home and abroad. Richard looked at me with a pride he didn't try to hide. He laughed with me as I told him my plans to take the brand international. We toasted with pomegranate juice and shared a chocolate dessert, savoring the taste of a victory that had nothing to do with money, but with reclaimed dignity. For my father, seeing me free from that parasite who only wanted to exploit our resources and transformed into a strong, confident woman was worth more than any investment. In the middle of our conversation, my gaze drifted unintentionally outside through the glass. The thick, soundproof window separated the restaurant's climate-controlled world from the sticky heat and traffic noise of the street. Outside, the midday traffic was chaos, honking horns mixed with the smell of exhaust. In front of the restaurant, in a makeshift parking strip, a thin man in a dirty orange vest was arguing with the owner of a luxury sedan. The driver was insulting him for not preventing a small scratch on the car's body, probably caused by a passing motorcycle. The car attendant kept his head down, clasping his hands in a pleading gesture, begging not to be hit or have the police called. He was deeply tanned, with long, dusty hair and sunken cheekbones from poor nutrition. I squinted, confused by a sense of familiarity, and then I recognized him. It was Kevin. My ex-husband, who once strode around in ties and expensive watches, was now there, apologizing for a scratch on a stranger's car, hoping for a few coins. I felt a slight flutter in my chest, but not of nostalgia. It was more of a distant compassion, the kind one feels for any stranger who has fallen on hard times. I shifted my gaze a few yards away, to the sidewalk across the street. There, sitting on a soda crate, was Rose, in a faded dress and a frayed apron. In front of her was a small tray with packets of tissues and face masks, which she offered to passers-by in a tired voice. Her face, once covered in layers of expensive makeup, was now deeply wrinkled and smudged with city grime. She was almost unrecognizable, but I knew those features well. The woman who had called me foolish and useless at social gatherings, who had flaunted fake bags as if they were jewels, was now holding out her hand, begging someone to buy a pack of tissues for a coin. The scene was so ironic it seemed straight out of a morality tale. I felt as though fate were showing me, without words, the end of a story that began with pride and contempt. At that moment, Kevin finished taking the driver's insults and looked up at the restaurant window, perhaps seeking shelter from the sun. His eyes met mine. Time seemed to stop for him. He froze, in his stained vest and plastic sandals, staring through the glass at the woman who had been his wife. He saw me sitting at an elegant table, well-dressed, my skin glowing, surrounded by an atmosphere of success and peace. He saw the beautifully presented dishes, the sparkling glasses, my father's smile. He understood, in a single blow, everything he had thrown away. Not just the money, but the respect, the trust, and the love. He wanted to scream, to call my name, to run to the door, but at the same time, he knew that glass wasn't just a window. It was an invisible wall built of his decisions, his betrayals, and their consequences. Beside him, Rose also noticed my presence. Her mouth fell open, her eyes filling with tears as she continued to hold a pack of tissues that no one was buying. Kevin felt his chest tighten until it hurt. I held his gaze for only a few seconds. There was no resentment in my eyes, no cruel satisfaction, only calm. It was the look of someone contemplating a chapter of her life that was already over, a chapter she had no intention of reopening. Then I turned my gaze back to my father, who had also noticed the scene but paid it no mind. He smiled, as if to say without words that it no longer affected us. I called the waiter over and, with a delicate but firm gesture, asked him to draw the curtains on the window because the sun was getting too bright. The waiter nodded and began to slowly lower the heavy golden curtain. Inch by inch, the world outside disappeared. Kevin watched as his last visual connection to me was gently closed off, just as any possibility of returning to my life was definitively shut. When the curtain reached the bottom, the restaurant's interior was bathed in a soft, cozy light, while outside, the heat, noise, and dust continued to reign. For me, that gesture symbolized the complete closing of the book on my past with him. For Kevin and Rose, however, the punishment had no expiration date. They would continue to live with the knowledge that they had destroyed their own fortune out of pride and ambition. There were no visible bars, but they were locked in a prison made of their own regrets. 5 years is not a short time when it comes to turning a life around. One morning, at a makeshift coffee stand in a corner of the wholesale market, Kevin sat at a splintered wooden table, staring into a cup of watery coffee and a piece of cold, fried dough. His features had aged beyond his years. His hair had thinned and lightened. His skin was cracked from the sun, and his yellowed teeth betrayed too many cheap cigarettes smoked to quell his anxiety. He wore a t-shirt with a political campaign slogan and a pair of worn-out shorts. The market's din vendors, shouting deals, carts squeaking, radios blaring, had become the soundtrack of his existence. The owner of the small cafe turned up the volume on an old television perched on a shelf. The morning news was running a feature on successful female entrepreneurs. Kevin glanced up without interest, but his heart clenched when he recognized the face filling the screen. It was Claire. She appeared in a beautiful garden in front of a house even larger than her father's, with an elegant facade and meticulously landscaped flowers. She wore a sober, polished outfit, and her smile was so serene it seemed to have erased any shadow of the past. Beside her, the report showed a well-dressed man with a kind expression, holding a small, laughing child in his arms. It was her new husband, a renowned architect, and the little one was their son. In the interview, Claire spoke of her fashion company, which now exported to several countries, and of the unwavering support of her current husband, who, she said, always treated her with respect and tenderness. The camera also showed the headquarters of a foundation Claire had created to help women who were victims of abandonment and abuse in their homes, a project born from her own experience. Listening to those words, Kevin felt a mix of vicarious pride and a sharp pain in his chest. He never heard his own name mentioned. In Claire's public story, he was nothing more than an erased shadow, a stumble that had pushed her to become someone stronger. He then thought of Rose, who now spent her days bedridden in that same miserable room, semi-paralyzed after a stroke. Her old high society friends never visited. The woman who had lived for appearances was ending her days between damp walls, occasionally weeping for memories no one shared with her anymore. Kevin left a few coins on the cafe table and stood up. He walked out into the market, where the ground was wet from a recent rain and the smell of wilted vegetables mixed with smoke from the food stalls. He picked up the sacks he had to carry that day and started walking through the muddy aisles. His legs felt heavy and his shoulders ached, but the weight crushing him most wasn't in the sacks, it was on his conscience. Outside, the rain began to fall again, a light drizzle that plastered the dust to his face. The drops slid down his cheeks, mingling with the tears he no longer bothered to hide. He finally understood that his real punishment wasn't material poverty, but the brutal evidence that he once held a diamond in his hands, a good wife, a generous father-in-law, a stable life, and he had traded it all for a common stone that only shone in his imagination. His mother's pride, the appearance of wealth, his own vanity. Fate had written a perfect and relentless justice, and all he had left was to keep walking, carrying not just sacks of goods, but also the weight of a regret that would follow him to the last day of his life.